It's my pleasure to introduce Omar McRoberts. He's an associate professor, Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago, my beloved University of Chicago. Omar's scholarly and teaching interests include sociology of religion, urban sociology, urban poverty, race, and collective action. His first book is Streets of Glory, Church and Community in a Black Urban Neighborhood, and I think many of you in this room are already familiar with this book. And it's based on an ethnographic study of religious life in what he calls Four Corners. It's a poor, predominantly black neighborhood in Boston that contained 29 congregations. And in his book, he explains the high concentration, wide variety, and ambiguous social impact of religious activity in the neighborhood. It won the 2005 Distinguished Book Award from the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. And it's on our reading list, right? Everybody knows that for the Sociology of Religion exam. Omar is currently conducting a study of black religious responses to and influences on social welfare policy since the New Deal, culminating with George Bush's Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. And this is what you're talking about today. And he's also initiating an ethnographic project on cultures of death and dying among black congregations in low-income urban contexts. Please, with me, welcome.
Before, and so I'm particularly excited about this talk. We have a lovely campus, and I look forward to engaging with you. This project started long ago, perhaps too long ago at this point. I'm about a year out from completing a book manuscript. But the project began in 2001 when President George W. Bush established, by executive order, the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. The stated purpose of the office was to level the playing field, to level an uneven playing field where religious institutions could not compete on equal footing with secular agencies for funding. And so the idea was to encourage religious congregations to apply for public funding for their social service programs and to remove certain legal and administrative barriers, impediments to such applications. Quite predictably, the staging of the announcement gave the appearance, at least, that black clergy had had some input in the creation of the office, and that it should be a normal thing for African American clergy to support the office, and that black clergy in particular would benefit from the work of the office. And so when Bush established the office, the ceremony included moments with him standing there surrounded by, flanked by mostly African American clergy. Now my scholarly concern at that time was not whether those things were true. What struck me as sociologically interesting was that none of the clergy flanking George W. Bush were really recognizable as part of what we would associate with the older civil rights cadre of activist black clergy. No Jesse Jackson, no John Lewis, which is understandable given the political fault lines between Bush and that civil rights cadre. What this meant, though, is that by establishing the office, Bush had not only aimed a bellows at an already blazing public debate about the relationship between church and state and the role of religious organizations in social welfare provision, he also propelled a new set of black ministers into a national spotlight previously enjoyed almost exclusively by black clergy identified with national civil rights agendas. particularly black Pentecostals like Sheryl Sanders, Eugene Rivers, and so on. And these emerging clergy were partial to a congregation-based, moral character-building, human service strategy, the likes of which were championed by the office. And so it occurred to me that the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives might primarily be a cultural vehicle set in motion to promote a moral reform approach to the problem of abject human suffering. The office would then help link local religious institutions with all kinds of social service agencies, funding outlets, not just public ones, so that they might act on a moral reform orientation as opposed to other orientations, like, for example, the justice-oriented social gospel or civil rights orientations, which tend to emphasize collective responsibility for poverty and suffering and structural solutions rather than individualistic solutions to those problems. If that program of cultural adjustment succeeded, it would alter religious self-expectations about what it means to express religious faith for the benefit of the world. And that would constitute a sort of state manipulation of the religious, cultural, and institutional milieu. And that's my key interest here. But when I turned to the literature in the sociology of religion, I found little to nothing about the state influencing the churches through social policy discourse and the establishment of state agencies to promote ideas about the nature of poverty and suffering. It's as if we imagine that in the U.S., at least the most significant thing the state did or ever could have done to condition the landscape of public religious expression was to produce the First Amendment, which, of course, articulates disestablishment and protects the freedom of religious practice. As the story goes, this shapes the religious environment by allowing what we commonly now call a religious market, a kind of a free market to flourish. The only task then, the only task left then is to explain what happens in this ostensibly free market. Right? Why do some religious institutions win and others lose in the competition for members? And why ostensibly rational actors, rational religious shoppers choose this or that religious product? Now, as we try to apprehend the empirical concern at hand, we inherit a couple of problems from that perspective. One is that it begins with a flat conceptualization of the state. It's as if the state influence on the churches could only consist of legislation or jurisprudence regarding the ontological distinction between church and state. And we also begin with an equally flat understanding of religion as firms, as merely firms competing for members. I think we actually can get a much better grip on current and previous moments in religious politics and political culture in general if we actually think of the state more the way that certain students of social policy formation think of the state. And here I'm drawing especially on state-centered theorists in political science and in sociology who are concerned with the impact of the state on, one, the origins and the expansion of modern social welfare policies, and second, on the development of welfare politics. And these are, I'm engaging here with people like Theda Skocpol, Edwin Amenta, and so on. And what this literature tells us is this. Once a specific social policy is set in motion, it can also condition the form and the content of politics itself, of mass politics. And so it's not just that mass politics leads to social policy formation, right? That there's a social movement pushing for some set of policies, but rather once those policies are enacted, that politics are also transformed by the implementation of that policy. And theorists call this policy feedbacks. So new interest groups might emerge to fight for the expansion of an existing policy, or they might dissolve. An interest group might dissolve when it appears that a certain policy intervention has addressed a portion of public need. I would add as well, following the political scientist Joel Migdal, that we can, and indeed we must, understand the state as a projected image, as well as a set of institutional practices. I can picture these images of the state as they're crafted by various agents of the state with various agenda, leaving their marks on the body politic as well. Now, all this doesn't mean that politics is totally shaped by the state. Political challengers remain strategically motivated agents who choose to act or not act in one way or another. And their actions can and do pressure shifts in legislation and state formation. I could just as easily give a talk this afternoon about how black religious institutions have over the decades influenced social welfare policy instead of the other way around. But the mechanisms that make that direction of influence possible are fairly well conceptualized and theorized. Particularly the impact of black religious institutions on policy via social movements. For example, the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, which was very much a movement for economic equality as well as for civil equality. It's less well understood, though. In fact, it's hardly noticed, I think, how the state directly and indirectly creates opportunities for certain kinds of public religious thought and activity to emerge while discouraging the emergence of others. So from a state-centered vantage point then, we can imagine the state impacting the very landscape of religious expression through mechanisms that have nothing to do with the First Amendment, or with judiciary contests over the interpretation of the First Amendment, or whether the state says you can't chew peyote in prison, or you can't put a menorah in front of City Hall, and these sorts of things, right? But first we'll need to take another conceptual step, which is basically to take organized religion as a critical facet of the body politic, which gets us even more intellectual traction as we think about the influence of the state on the churches. And this means that we think of religion not just as a set of competing terms. We think of religion as a field of discourse, a public sphere or a set of public spheres where ideas about the good and the right, and about the nature of suffering and evil, and about the origins and purpose of human life and human agency are debated. And in the case of black religion, where ideas about black peoplehood, nationhood, and collective destiny are constituted and contested and acted on. We even might think of the field of religion as a set of social movements or as a set of politically concerned institutions in themselves. And all of this together, I think, fits under Jose Casanova's public religion rubric. So let me turn to the empirical matter at hand. This talk will not be about the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. By the way, the entire project now, I guess that was kind of an old bio, actually extends through Obama's first administration because there have been so many interesting developments in black ecumenical movements since 2008. So call me nuts, doing a study from the New Deal through Obama's first administration. But you know, you go where the word takes you. So I'll be talking today about the New Deal era. Ultimately, in the book that will emerge in the next year, I'll argue that the social policy-based mechanisms that through which the state sometimes influences the churches are very similar now to when they were in the New Deal and during the War on Poverty and Great Society period. And I'll explain how those mechanisms have operated, however, to very different political effects in each policy era. And I'll focus on the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the National Baptist Convention, the Church of God in Christ, actually the Nation of Islam. This will be the first study to sort of take the Nation of Islam seriously, sort of in comparative perspective with other black religious groups. And it emerges during the Great Depression, right? So today I want to share with you especially what I've learned about black Methodists and Baptists in the New Deal era as a result of considerable wallowing in archival resources in various parts of the country. And I'm going to try to illustrate some of these mechanisms of church, state church influence, and explain why we can't fully understand some key structural and ideological developments in black religion during this period without accounting for the role of the state and its agents, particularly the executive branch. So the structural development at issue here is the birth of the national black ecumenical movement. Ecumenism is not the excessive use of cumin when you're cooking. It's the cooperation of denominations or clergy representing different denominations. And however brief or limited the nature and the scope of the cooperation, ecumenism is important not so much because it constitutes a shift in denominational market shares, although it can have implications for that as well, but because it always represents a shift in how denominations view and relate to each other. Moreover, the advent of an ecumenical movement often constitutes a shift in the landscape of public religious expression, whether that expression be political or social or economic in nature. So in 1934, the first national black ecumenical association emerges as the Fraternal Council of Negro Churches. Now, there certainly were cultural and institutional impetuses for the mobilization of a group like this that had little to do with the state. One important push was the failure of the major white ecumenical organization, the Federal Council of Churches of Christ, the failure of that body to take black social justice issues seriously in its programs, despite its broad social gospel or Christian social justice standpoint, and also its embrace of black denominations, mainly as silent members. Another push toward black ecumenical movement in this period was the mounting sense within the black denominations that secular organizations like the NAACP, the Urban League, while worthy of church support, were ill-equipped to deal with the spiritual and moral crisis facing a rapidly urbanizing black populace. And indeed, when we step inside the portrait painted in the periodicals and the journals of the Baptist and black Methodist denominations, and in the minutes of their annual conventions, and so on, it appears that black churches were under attack by the forces of secular blackness. The elites, typically who appear in these records, feel attacked first and foremost by secular black intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois, for example. Black political leaders cultural luminaries like Langston Hughes. There was a Langston Hughes poem that describes the plight of a poor black woman and her child, and I think at some point the child says, "Now I know God doesn't love me." And the poem is reproduced in one of the journals of one of these denominations, and it creates this huge uproar. Langston Hughes gone bad, gone atheist, right? And the whole New Negro movement, that's a bunch of sort of secular atheist communist type. Then there's the black newspapers, printing cartoons with showing godless Russia, with people going to school, enjoying health care, and then they show Christian America with a black man swinging from a tree, right? So there's a sense of even, black religion being under attack by the black press. But also, there's a sense of being under attack by certain maverick black clergy, like Adam Clayton Powell, Senior, and like Bishop Reverdy Ransom, and you'll hear from at least one of them later in the talk, operating in the Baptist and the Methodist folds, respectively. So perhaps the black ecumenical movement was in part a response to this feeling of being under siege. Well, I think that's true to a point. All of these propositions are true to a point. The thing, though, is that none of this was new, really. Not only were environmental pressures long established, but this wasn't even the first time that black clergy had attempted to form a nationwide ecumenical activist body. I think each of the previous attempts failed, though, because there didn't appear to be any sufficiently clear national target or federal target for a nationwide ecumenical activist body. The Hoover administration wasn't, that is the administration that preceded Roosevelt, wasn't the best target. Despite its tendency to ignore the plight of black people, it was still the better of evils, since the vast majority of African Americans, including important religious leaders like the head of the Black Baptist, L.K. Williams, were still politically aligned with the party, the Republican Party of Hoover, the Republican Party of the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln. Now, my argument is that this absence of an appropriate institutional target for national church-based action did not persist indefinitely, if I may speak of a persistent absence. Things changed in 1933 with the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the commencement of his first wave of New Deal programs. Now here we get a shift in both the image and the practice of the federal state. The federal government, particularly the executive administration, appears to be drawing power unto itself while steadily cultivating a capacity for autonomous action through myriad New Deal agencies. So this administration seems to be making decisions, often discriminatory decisions, every day that directly affect the well-being of individual black people. As the realm of federal activity becomes the most visible and consequential site of discrimination, national politics, national mobilization begins to become the obvious mode of contesting this discrimination, right? And this is why during these years we see secular black organizations coming into existence and reorganizing themselves in order to generate a national politics of advocacy and agitation. For example, the Joint Committee on National Recovery comes into existence during this period in order to challenge discrimination against black people in New Deal programs. The Urban League The NAACP began to expand their capacities for federal lobbying, establishing offices in Washington, D.C. and so on, in order to do the same. Meanwhile, on the image side of things, Roosevelt, his administration, Eleanor Roosevelt, who in many ways was much more aggressive on race issues than the president, and the Democratic Party bureaucracy, which I take as an appendage of the executive branch when your party is in office, begin to project an image of this president as one who can be held personally accountable for the welfare of the citizenry. And I'm referring here to the image of the chief of state, which is, of course, a largely symbolic and morale-building role, as opposed to the chief executive or head of government, which is different. This is as chief of state, this is the president as the central icon of the state. And it's here that Chief of State Roosevelt often presented a culturally, even spiritually based analysis of the country's problems. American culture has fallen under the spell of laissez-faire individualism and has subsequently come to imagine the role of the citizenry as being merely a source of labor and consumption for the market, rather than the market existing solely to meet the material needs of the citizenry with efficiency and fairness. Now, the idea here, in some of that rhetoric coming out of the executive office, the idea was mainly to disarm Protestant skepticism about a president who was still associated in major sectors of the American imagination with communism, urban Catholics, and whiskey. But the effect of all of this was to crystallize an image of a vastly powerful and yet eerily imminent and accountable national leader. And a leader to boot who was quite comfortable with the rhythms and the reasonings and the rhetorics of mainstream Protestantism. So these shifts in state image and practice become the primary pull toward Black ecumenical movement, just as it spurred a boom in secular national organizing. Now, to Reverend E. Ransom, the Methodist bishop, the powerfully eloquent and yet controversial maverick bishop, who'd been calling for Black ecumenical social action since something like 1917. This symbolic and practical centralization of power represented a golden opportunity to leap onto the national political scene as a leader of a national activist program. This program would distinguish itself from secular Black efforts by articulating an unabashedly religious critique of society, the market, and politics, and by defending the essential role of organized religion in Black life. And even, perhaps more importantly, it would distinguish itself from previous attempts at national Black ecumenism by embracing a very pragmatic and progressive approach to Black public religious expression. That is, using all the material and cultural resources at hand to respond to the changing political milieu. They would, for example, the Fraternal Council of Negro Churches would advocate church-based mass protests. This is the 30s, as a way to challenge the federal government, and particularly the president, to make real for Black people the social, the justice-oriented, social gospel-y flavor of some of the rhetorics coming out of the New Deal. So Ransom sends out the call to ministers in 1933 on the very tail of Roosevelt's inauguration. And in the organization's founding document, Ransom points quite directly to the state as the impetus for the timing of the movement. He says, and I quote, "At this very hour, when the social and industrial structure of the nation is being reorganized, the shifting state, through the various codes promulgated by government, the power and influence of the Negro is almost negligible. The Negro Church is the only voice in this land that has sufficient carrying power to reach our people wherever found, and instead of the counsels of defeat, surrender, discouragement, and despair, to arouse and organize the potentialities latent in the race." Subsequent missives similarly target the federal state, sometimes listing resolutions against blatant forms of discrimination perpetrated by New Deal agencies such as the Civilian Conservation Corps, Social Security, Public Works, Federal Emergency Relief, the Agricultural Adjustment Administrations, and so on. Now, even up to its demise in 1960, the Fraternal Council of Negro Churches never really fully realized Bishop Ransom's vision of a mass movement united by nationally by a black church, by the black church. The important thing to understand here, though, is that the first national black ecumenical movement, the first attempt at this kind of public religious expression to be any real longevity, appeared when it did and cohered when it did in response to federal social policy and state building. The form and the content of the ecumenical body were a strategic response on the part of certain black clergy to a sudden shift in the practice and the image of the federal state. As content is concerned, it's actually very crucial that this effort took on the critical mood of the social gospel and at least advocated direct protest as a legitimate strategy for church people, which sets the stage for the institutionally and ideologically for the next major black ecumenical effort, which is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which many more people are familiar with. This is Dr. King's organization. Even as the Fraternal Council was fading away, and actually as it was fading away, at one point they asked King to become the new head. He declined and took on the SCLC instead. The SCLC would begin to embody the social critique and justice imperatives of the social gospel while actually realizing a strategy of direct protest that was theorized in the 30s by this group that emerges under Roosevelt. And of course, even now, the activities of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference still supply the dominant image of black religious activism as black churches working across denominations nationally to mobilize a mass base to pose a national political challenge to federal government, right? Okay, so I've described a rather indirect or inadvertent mechanism of state impact on the church. This is policy feedbacks as policy leading to the expansion of the state a certain way, a need for the president to project himself a certain way, the appearance of power becoming centralized, and then mass politics, in this case religious politics, responding in institutional and ideological form shifts. But now I want to talk about a more hands-on approach, what I have tentatively been calling hermeneutical regulation. And this is the attempt of particular state administrations to manage their own image in the eyes of the body politic by actively working with and even trying to alter religious ideas about suffering, peoplehood, justice, social action, and so on that circulate within the body politic. It's important to begin by noting here that Franklin Roosevelt didn't win his first election with the support of African Americans. The Democratic Party was understood to be the party of the openly violent Jim Crow South. But by the middle of his first term, Roosevelt and the Democratic National Committee were well aware that they would at least need to reach out to northern blacks. a growing population. This is still during part of the Great Migration. So they realized they would need to reach out to northern blacks who had been there for generations and those who had recently arrived, having migrated northward. Voting blacks would decisively move into the Democratic camp in the 1936 election, but there was nothing guaranteed about that ahead of time. That meant that Roosevelt had to appease black people in a variety of ways, who had been only partly swayed by the availability of life-saving emergency relief during the first New Deal. Black secular and religious publications at the time were still brimming with reports of racial discrimination in the New Deal, which was sometimes called the Raw Deal, and were bursting with incredulity over his refusal to promote an anti-lynching bill for fear of upsetting this very fragile Democratic coalition of Southern and Northern legislators. And so, first, the administration tries to appeal to blacks by appointing a number of Democratic black elites to multiple New Deal agencies and regular departments of government. Some of them became known as Roosevelt's Black Brain Trust, or his Black Cabinet. In the meantime, the Democratic National Committee begins to go about some of the most, I think, important work of a party machine, which is not only to measure, but to shape public opinion. Part of that effort took place through a subcommittee called the Good Neighbor League and its so-called Colored Committee, which Roosevelt created himself at the advisement of a cabinet member and through his own special authority as head of the party. So when it came to the black denominations, this special colored committee of the Good Neighbor League was not simply to distract religious people from Roosevelt's beholdenness to Southern Democrats or downplay rampant discrimination in the New Deal while highlighting its tangible benefits to black people, and they did all that. And a lot of their outreach did take place through churches, actually, Catholic churches. Their primary targets were labor folks, Catholic churches, and black religions. They also had to try and reorient a very prominent sense of divinely ordained peoplehood, a religio-racial identity, which had for 74 years up to that point identified Abraham Lincoln, because Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and his party as no small part of God's providential plan for black people. And we can think of this as a kind of a variation on civil religion, right? Which, like any national civil religion, in my estimation, does four things. It enshrines a transcendent sense of peoplehood, including a sense of what that people is like in terms of character. We rock, for example. Second, it propounds a theodicy, a theology of suffering that makes cosmic sense of the otherwise pointless suffering of that people. Third, it identifies and it beatifies key prophets. And four, it offers an eschatological or religious teleological understanding of where that people is headed. And usually that people, whether a race or a nation, is heading for some type of messianic or utopian glory. Nobody assumes that things will ultimately be worse. So these are narratives of hope and progress, right? Now Roosevelt, as chief of state, or as the Pope of American civil religion, was already starting to weave rhetorical threads into his self-legitimating version of national civil religion. Roosevelt's civil religion made sense of the Depression as a period of redemptive suffering. which under his prophetic leadership and through New Deal social policy would give way to an enlightened period of social planning, of economic justice, of cultural revitalization, the results of which would permit America to realize its utopic promise and its messianic role as a beacon of democracy to the world. Right? This is Rousseau's top-down civil religion and not Durkheim's effervescent, bubbling up from the bottom civil religion. But there's no reason for black people to see themselves as a part of that national narrative during that time, right? In the discursive space of the black Baptist and Methodist denominations, cynicism about Roosevelt held sway all the way through his first administration. And when we consider the prevalence during that period of public theologizing about the nature of black progress and the significance of Lincoln in that progress, it becomes clear that a very prominent and distinct black civil religious sensibility was at stake. One that tended to legitimate black loyalty to the Republican Party, and that tended to prefer political accommodation to social protest. Here's an example of that sensibility. In 1929, in an issue of the National Baptist Voice, there appears the text, is that clear? No, it's not. Let's see. All right. There appears in the National Baptist Voice, one of the journals of the National Baptist Convention, the text of a sermon delivered by a black minister, Reverend J.L. Caston, to a largely white congregation in Portland, Oregon, entitled Two Emancipators, Jesus and Lincoln. And for dramatic effect, apparently the minister had mounted portraits of the two great emancipators on either side of him, like maybe the giant cutout type. And I want you to remember this image, right? He then proceeds to flesh out this comparison at great length. And at one point, he even attributed limited divine attributes to Lincoln. The crux of the talk, though, was that Lincoln's emancipation was not yet complete. Black folks had not yet reached the eschatological glory point of full freedom and equality. And yet, quote, the centuries since Calvary have silently recorded alternations of cosmos and chaos. That's a theodical moment. In a sense, the chaos is explained by the cosmos in the spiritual realm, and still the purpose of God in Christ arises. Jesus, who was and is less understood than any other person, holds the key for the unlocking of prison doors and the liberation of captives. Lincoln was but a miniature reflection of the great emancipator. So there's the prophetic connection. He can only aid in the abolition of physical slavery. Jesus makes men free in every sense. The freedom that Lincoln gave to America is not complete. There arises, therefore, the crying need for an emancipator. That's the eschatological moment. So, and it follows after that, of course, that the additional emancipator would be Republican and not a Democrat. So here we have a kind of spiritual transmission occurring within the party system, or at least a certain part of the public's idea of what a party is. And so the challenge for Democrats at this point was to figure out how to make that flame leap from Lincoln, the Republican, to Roosevelt, the Democrat. At this moment, the cautiously pro-Roosevelt voices in the denominational journals and minutes were easily outnumbered by voices critical of the New Deal state on religious grounds, right? Roosevelt appeared to be destroying black people, throwing us off a divinely appointed course and into a genocidal trap of of moral corrosion by dole and by whiskey. And so this gives you a sense of what the Good Neighbor League was contending with. They're dealing with a religious hermeneutic, a civil religious hermeneutic, or a mode of interpretation, which at the moment is interpreting Roosevelt and the New Deal not as a friend, but as like the cosmic foil of Black progress. And this is coming out of spaces of formal religious discourse, these journals and these minutes and so on. So thus begins the process of hands-on hermeneutical regulation. The League's contact, the Good Neighbor League's contact with the churches took place largely through the AME Church, through the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the hierarchical structure of which could be accessed through a few key sympathetic bishops. The National Baptist Convention was less useful as a national institutional structure because it's not connectional or hierarchical, and you can't tell some bishop to tell a bunch of other churches they better have one of these meetings at their church to support the Good Neighbor League. But they did go to individual churches, individual Baptist churches. Anyhow, the Good Neighbor League plants good neighbor political discussions and discussion clubs in hundreds of churches around the country. And plans for late September a set of spectacles, this is late September, I guess 35, to be held in local churches in 24 northern cities in honor of the 74th anniversary of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. So there was a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. There was the actual Emancipation Proclamation, but the dates didn't line up with their goals, so they figured out that they had to get emancipation in there in order to get Lincoln in there. So, and the 25th and the largest of these events was held at Madison Square Garden in New York City. So these events really capture the hermeneutical strategy and the hands-on sort of cultural strategy of the campaign. The idea is to fold Black civil religious sensibility into Roosevelt's emerging civil religious rhetoric by linking his trope of progress with Black theological and eschatological tendencies. And that would require highlighting those Black religious ideas and figures and Black religious characters that did not associate Black progress and deliverance with traditional party loyalty or party covenant, which is really what it was. But rather, who had a pragmatic flexibility in all political matters. The Democrats knew that they could highlight and promote at least that strain of Black pragmatist religious thought that still imagined somehow a role for prophetic presidents. Once lifted up to a position of prominence, this flavor of thinking and this set of characters might open a larger space within the Black religious sphere for the idea that Roosevelt, and not his competitor Landon in that election, was the authentic prophet in that time. So in these local Good Neighbor League meetings, a lot of the speeches, and they had one template that they sort of mailed around to the different churches, and then preachers would sort of preach the speech that was written possibly somewhere in the White House. A lot of the speeches emphasized the church's role in freeing or emancipating Black people from stultifying political traditions, which actually retarded Black progress toward ultimate freedom. But it was the Madison Square Garden rally event called I told you, it was the 74th anniversary of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, a celebration of Negro progress. Here, they most forcefully brought together the theme of emancipation with Roosevelt's prophetic role in Black progress. And this event, by the way, was broadcast all over the country by radio. Roosevelt sent a message to the rally, and there were something like 16,000 people there. the AME Bishop Richard Wright read Roosevelt's message, which lifted up the idea that black progress was central to the nation's realization of its own material, social, and political ideals. He congratulated Negroes on their record, expressed his hope that, quote, in the future as in the past, they will continue to show intelligence, industry, and fortitude in striving for the best our democracy offers. This is folding the story of black progress into the more general story of American progress, right? Then Bishop Wright delivers his own address called The Second Emancipation, which he closed by inviting all to, quote, join in carrying forward the spirit of Abraham Lincoln by supporting the social and economic program of America's second great emancipator and humanitarian, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now here, Lincoln's spirit has been emancipated from his party so that it can preside over a new public application of black religion, right? And a democratic chief of state. In his respective keynote, broadcast all over the country, right? Reverend E. Ransom, once the maverick, compares Roosevelt to the biblical Joshua, quote, who had truly been born to lead his people into the promised land, unquote, and claimed that Negroes had progressed more under this administration than under any president since the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. And then, as if rhetorical connections between emancipation and pragmatic political freedom, between Roosevelt and black providence, and all of this, and religious faith, right, were not enough, the event planners resorted to visual aids. This is how the New York Age, the New York Age, a black New York newspaper, described it. A highlight was reached in the evening surprises when the Michaud chorus stood and turned to the rear of the rostrum, chanting a battle hymn. The Michaud chorus was like this 200-person choir from one of the biggest black churches in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. The Michaud chorus stood and turned to the rear of the rostrum, chanting a battle hymn and pointing upward to two huge American flags suspended from the ceiling. The flags drew apart and the audience responded appreciatively as they slowly came into view. A huge painting depicting Jesus Christ in the center as the emancipator of sin, Abraham Lincoln on the left as the emancipator from bondage, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt on the right as the emancipator of social injustice. Here's the one of the flyers from that event. Now you notice people like Ransom, Reverend E. Ransom, getting all this, you know, they were mavericks in their own denomination. What's that?
Cat Calloway.
Oh yeah, Cat Calloway was there. This was huge. This is bigger than Obama showing up with Beyonce and what's his name in Ohio. This is bigger than that. And I have the actual picture that descended from the ceiling. It took me a long time to find it. Can you imagine?
Prayer.
What's that?
The prayer of being anointed.
Yeah, yeah. If you can't imagine this, I have it. It gets better.
It's Washington?
Yes, Washington, Lincoln, and then the cross is behind, so Jesus is there as well. Um, this was circulating during Bush's period. It's called A Prayer for Peace. So of course, I've been looking for depictions with Obama, and there are pictures with Obama and Jesus, and then there are pictures with Obama and Lincoln, and he played up the Lincoln connection a lot in his first run. But I haven't found one that really triangulates it, right, and makes the explicitly religious connection with Jesus, and then the prophetic charisma coming from Lincoln or somebody else, right? But there are ones with, I have a big giant picture that I bought, found in kind of a rummage with Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, Jesus, Dr. King, and somebody, and Lincoln. So this is a whole area in itself, and the book will go into some detail about the meaning of and the significance of this kind of iconography. But nobody asks about church and state when these things are circulating, right? So of course, clergy from both denominations immediately registered their utmost indignation with the Roosevelt campaign for trying to use the Emancipation Proclamation and explicit religious themes to coax black votes. And they severely chided black people for being so stupid as to celebrate a preliminary Emancipation Day with Democrats who continued to sanction all kinds of black repression in the South. But those critics sort of may have missed the symbolic significance of what had actually happened. The Democratic campaign had almost instantaneously made people like Bishop Ransom and Bishop Wright in the Methodist camp, Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, and others of their ilk, some of the most visible and influential clergy in the nation. And in that position of prominence, those clergy presented the logic of an alternative black civil religiosity, an alternative understanding of what black public religion is about, which identified progress with pragmatic openness rather than adherence to traditions. And that allowed them to remove party loyalty from the equation and situate Roosevelt within a black eschatology of liberation. As far as I know, this alternative expression had never enjoyed that kind of visibility. The effect in black denominational discourse is that this actually does become a kind of a normative center of its own, as opposed to the maverick position that this sort of thinking held earlier. Ultimately, that position accumulated enough support within the denominations to become movements. The Progressive National Baptist Convention, which Dr. King played a role in founding, grew out of that movement. Eventually, they left the National Baptist Convention to start a denomination committed to these kinds of activist principles. And again, the social gospel underpinnings of the later civil rights movement come partly from this period, and we can't separate the state from that emergence. So the idea here is not to depict the churches as passive. As I said before, this could have easily been a talk about black churches acting strategically to challenge the state, but then I would sound like 20 other scholars who've already written about that masterfully. But work, again, on that has already been done. I'm thinking here about the inadvertent, at times, and sometimes quite deliberate regulatory deeds of the state. This is about the state shifting in image and practice in ways that prompt new forms of religious action to emerge, It's about state attempts to alter the landscape of religious ideas and voices using spectacle of various sorts, so that the most politically desirable ideas remain most visible. This is a story about policy feedbacks, right? Which, by the way, turn out not to be as inadvertent as policy feedback theorists tend to think, right? In the typical state-centered policy feedback story, what you get is a policy being implemented, and it, on its own, sort of changes the way people do politics, right? Part of what I'm pointing out that is, it's an innovation in policy feedback theory, is that politicians and party captains have a vested interest in steering those feedbacks, right? In engineering the public's reaction to their own implemented policies and platforms. And that public includes religious publics, and that's where the church-state connection comes in. Those religious publics may have ideas about their own peoplehood, their own implicit nationhood, so to speak, that might need to be adjusted in order to build support for the ruling administration and its policies. That means trying to adjust the identity boundaries, perhaps, of those religious publics. So here we have agents of the state operating as creators and manipulators of multiple national mythologies, some of which are inseparable from religious content. But I hope it's clear also how much this understanding relies on a complex view of the state and an understanding of public religion as religion, in addition to formal practices and doctrines. When we combine these understandings of the state and religion, I think a whole new universe of inquiry into church-state relations opens up, particularly with regard to the impact of the state on the churches, on religion. Because we can now envision the state through institutional forms and policies and practices not necessarily having anything to do with legislation or jurisprudence about religion, helping to shape the terms of public religious discourse and the institutional shape of public religion, and perhaps even altering the very meaning of denominational competition for market shares, if that's what you're interested in. So thanks for your patience.
Thinking about Obama's administration and the challenge he faces with healthcare in particular and sort of the southern white religious arena. And I was wondering if you've seen any effort to take the civil religion in the South that the Republican Party seems to have co-opted so strongly and bring like the ideas of Southern religion more in line with this idea of like caring for our poor. So I was thinking in particular the use of Rick Warren during his first inauguration. Have there been efforts by the administration to reach out in those ways and sort of change the tenor of civil religion in Southern?
In the South. I think that's one example.
Yeah.
I'm not as kind of fluent in that as I am with some of the stuff regarding his outreach to African American churches. But, you know, some would say, there are a number of journalists at least who have pointed out that Obama's personal religiosity has changed in the last 4 years. That while his earliest projection of religiosity was a little more tentative and speculative, you know. Well, there are things in the Bible that I think are spot on, but then there are other things that I don't know, right? I don't know if I agree with that at all. And then, of course, the evangelicals are like, you can't say that, right? Right? This isn't a debate. Whereas what they note is that he appears more evangelical now, right? Again, in his personal projection of his religious walk. Although technically he was saved 25 years ago or something, right? There are people who still question that, and he, you know, whether it's an attempt to sway evangelicals or whether it's just the way his life has changed in the last 4 years, it seems as if that there's been a certain kind of a change in the way that he projects his religiosity. How that would specifically impact religious culture, public religious culture in southern states, I'm not sure. I don't think it. Yeah, I don't know what to. Especially looking at the returns on November 6th and all the southern states that he lost. I don't know if it made any difference. Yeah. Other thoughts?
Well, I'm curious, so, I mean, basically you have these kind of two mechanisms, right? The sort of crystallization of the power of the state that really black churches react to, and then the ways in which the Roosevelt administration tries to sort of co-opt them. What I'm wondering is, how distinctive is this particular reaction when you look at other publics, maybe other religious groups during that time? And so, like, who else were there others reacting to the strength of the state? And was the administration trying to co-opt other publics?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Federal Council of Churches of Christ was another example here. So they also begin to really pull together in a way that they really hadn't previously. And I believe Roosevelt gave speeches. So there's the Federal Council making demands on the New Deal state, mainly for expansion of programs. And then there's Roosevelt speaking at the Federal Council, right? And making a very pointed set of remarks with a certain kind of religious content, right? Designed to bolster to boost mainstream Protestant support for the New Deal. So it's like saying, here's how you should think about this in religious terms. So it's happening kind of both ways there as well. His outreach to Catholics was quite extensive. You know, similar things happened during the War on Poverty. Lyndon Johnson's outreach to Catholics was quite extensive. He appointed Sergeant Shriver, a very thoughtful Catholic, a very religious man, to head the War on Poverty. And his speeches are shot through with the spirituality of the War on Poverty. And then there's the whole story about extensive outreach to black churches and same stuff.
Do you find historically that this happens more in some periods than others?
Yeah, it's periods of major social policy transformation. So it's the New Deal, it's the War on Poverty, then it's the sort of dismantling of all of that, right? Which is, I identify as happening within a much longer period, which is why I go through Obama. It's sort of dismantling and intense contestation over what the state ought to do. In the Obama period, the third major national black ecumenical body appears. And it's the Conference of National Black Churches, and I've been able to participate ethnographically in that stuff. So it's been very, very rich to take it into the near present, although it will be very hard to just write it.
So it seems an interesting kind of subtext to at least part of the story is the role that media plays in how, particularly in these examples you're giving of where certain actors are kind of projected into these national positions, kind of like almost instantly based on how that's used. I was wondering, because you're covering such a long period of time that covers incredibly important transformations in media modes, just whether or not the way in which media has been used over time, whether the shifts in both its use and the modes of media, so like from radio to TV to internet, has altered the mechanisms by which that plays out, or whether it's kind of just been like more of the same but like bigger audiences.
Yeah, it's bigger and different audiences. Certainly different uses as well. So there's the example here of the Madison Square Garden event being broadcast over radio, which is a pretty sort of straight performance, right? In the 60s, what you get is, with television, you get, first of all, the civil rights movement itself being widely televised, in a sense, right? And the fact of the presence of the television camera making the moral contradiction of dogs and hoses and all that stuff being unleashed on peaceful protesters, it throws it into relief, and it throws it onto the global stage, right? You have Russians, godless communists, watching this, right? And they're thinking the U.S. has really got to get it together here. Or maybe we can infiltrate, and maybe the Communist Party can grow in the United States with all of this unrest. I mean, this is what part of what the Johnson administration was concerned about, right? The growth of these Communist Party and all sorts of insurgents and so on, and TV playing this huge role in that. So part of what happens during the war on poverty is they start to use TV a little differently. Or you get the Watts riots, right? You get all these rioting and all this other stuff all being broadcast. They actually produced a series of programs, television programs, which were broadcast on local stations, touting, playing up the many virtues of the war on poverty. And usually they featured local programs, local community action programs, some of which were in churches. So a minister might get up and say, oh, this program is, I can't believe the government's so great, and I've got this program, I'm turning people's lives around, I'm fulfilling my ministry, this sort of thing. And so they try to, they turn it around and use the television differently, really to try and preempt further unrest. Then you get the internet. And the most recent movement that I was telling you about, the Conference of National Black Churches, uses the internet extensively. And that would be sort of the most recent technological shift that's impacted the way movement looks. Now we live in an era where movement can be born on Facebook, where a whole uprising can be born in social media. And national black church organizers have followed suit.
Thanks, great talk. I was wondering about, whether this happened at this particular time, or it would have happened later. You're kind of telling a story about how there's a response to the state at a particular moment, and that reconfigures the religious field. Mm-hmm. Just wondering the extent to which the state was responding to things happening in the religious field and among black Protestants, or at least saw an opening that they were capitalizing on, and whether it could have happened later, even if this series of what you described didn't happen, that maybe they were headed in that direction anyway. I don't know.
Well, we could say that they were headed, that there were always voices in the black religious field that sounded like this. I mean, I mentioned that Reverend E. Ransom had been calling for a movement like this since something like 1917. But part of what I'm concerned with here are the conditions under which something really emerges and becomes successful. And there are lots of other possible scenarios for that. In this case, and even in some subsequent cases, the state seems to be playing a really juicy role. And so even though we could imagine lots of other conditions under which such a movement could have emerged, it looks like this confluence of factors is a uniquely powerful one, because the confluence of other factors prior to that didn't make it happen, right? And there was another. Okay, so one thing I might not have emphasized as much as I should. I mean, I used to describe this process with a metaphor, that you have and then I kind of tossed it out. But you know about the bonsai plants, and there's this whole art of getting a bonsai to sort of do it's this sort of bonsai thing, that the way it leans, and it kind of branches out a particular way. And you have ways of like adjusting the light, and it just kind of goes over there. And then it has major tendencies and minor tendencies. And you might decide to just snip off a couple of the major tendencies, and then, you know, put the light right on the minor tendencies so that it kind of thrives. And there's something happening here that's similar to that, right? Where the field of black religion, or religion in general, is flush with lots of ideas and advocates of those ideas. Not all of them are useful to politicians, right? And so politicians have to sort of imagine what black religion would look like, right? If it were to be useful, entirely useful for them. Thus, the changing of the light, the pruning, let's really encourage this branch, and this other branch won't get any attention at all, right? We'll appoint someone from this branch. In the war on poverty, you get black clergy getting folded into the actual state apparatus, the social welfare apparatus, into the state. So then you have people whose actual job it is to do outreach to churches, which wasn't the case in the New Deal, right? That was the Democratic Party, which, right, institutionally, you could say it's separate, and so on. So I wanted to throw that image out there, though, in answer to a part of your question. Weren't these tendencies there already? Yes. What the state did was amplify them and try to cultivate them as much as possible and bend them toward the interests of the New Deal. Mm-hmm.
How aware at the time were Republican Party leaders of the ramifications of what you've described,
Mm-hmm.
and how much sort of response to it, contestation? I mean, the state isn't just the party in power.
Right.
And how did that play out? Or did they just take for granted something that they shouldn't have taken for granted, and the sea change had happened before they even knew what was going to happen?
I think that's part of what happened, actually, that they were barely aware of the extent to which they were losing their hold, which was largely a symbolic hold anyway, on the black population, and how important it was that black people were moving by the millions from the south to the north, becoming enfranchised, getting folded into local democratic machines. And on top of that, alternative religious visions of what politics are about kind of filtering through as well. I don't think they really were on top of that very well. They did appoint the head of the National Baptist Convention, L.K. Williams, to a sort of a last-minute Republican Negro committee. And that was when they realized that not only did Roosevelt have this black cabinet or black brain trust, but that there was all this religion stuff going on as well. And and at the time, the National Baptist Convention was the largest black denomination. Now it's probably the Pentecostal, the Church of God in Christ. Back then, to appoint the head of the largest black denomination to your Negro effort, that's quite you could perceive it as a coup, except that I don't think that they really did anything. I saw no record of any serious effort, the likes of which the Democrats had managed to pull